Thanks for coming out today, on the, which began with a lot of snow, so I was a little worried, but Mark sent me an email, says I'm here, so we said we were going to go through with it. He came from Boston. Did you come last night? Or?
No, this morning.
This morning?
Yep.
How are the roads coming?
Abysmal.
Yes. At least one thing we don't have is traffic up here, so you didn't have to deal with that.
That's true, that's true.
So Mark was here a few years ago talking about another book that he wrote called The Lost Sea, which was about about sailing and disaster
whalers, yeah.
whalers and so forth. So now he's going to be talking about guys that put guys in the sea. And that's going to be the Boston Mob, the rise and fall of the New England mob, and its most notorious killer. I guess it was Joseph the Animal Barbosa. And all these guys have nicknames, right? I mean,
Even I got a nickname in the middle of it, yeah.
Oh, you did? Yeah. So you watch The Sopranos. Sopranos. Everybody has a nickname. And I don't know. When growing up Italian, I know that. Not to say that my family was connected, but everybody had a nickname, And I just always wondered.
What was yours, Jerry? What was yours? Come on,
Jerry the book.
Jerry the book.
Because you were taking the numbers?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But so Mark has written this book, and I thought we were going to have like black limousines pulling up in front of the library, but none yet. And he's a journalist that's written for the Boston Globe and the Boston Herald. I've already mentioned his other book, which we have in the collection, and we'll have this one too, so if you want to go and read. But he's going to be selling some copies of it as well. And I think he's going to try to talk about a little bit, maybe, did you do some research about the mob activities? And
I did find one connection between the Boston Mafia and your beautiful community.
Okay,
well, you'll get to that.
You'll be revealed, and of course you'll be on tape here. So.
That's when I walk out.
That's when you walk out. Okay. All right, so please welcome Marc Songini.
Oh, great.
Should write over a presentation, I guess.
Sorry, wrong slides. Different presentation. I'll have to wing this one. Actually, I thought that I would break up any real or imagined tension by having these completely adorable little critters. Actually, they are in the witness protection program. They were known in Boston as the two dogs, very tough enforcers. Only kidding. Thank you for having me. I love Brattleboro. I've been coming up here since I was a student at UMass. This really is, and this just isn't sucking up to the audience. This is one of the gems of New England as far as cities go, with a beautiful mix of culture and mountains, and you can ski and everything. And I do love it up here, and I do thank you for your hospitality, and thank you, Jerry, for having me up here. I really do appreciate it. Before I get going, I thought I'd bore you with a small anecdote. And after that, I'll be all warmed up and my nervousness will dissipate it somewhat. I took up writing to become somewhat famous because I'm named after a very famous man in very small circles. My uncle's name was Marco Songini, and believe it or not, he was a vaudeville midget. This is not to knock little people, he actually was. And he made a living as a performer. And sometime around 1948, the Cleveland Indians were at Fenway Park, and it was in the playoffs, and Ted Williams was at bat. So, very tense moment in that tiny historic artifact of Fenway. And my uncle, seeing the outfielders, the Indians, disperse because they knew that Williams could basically knock the thing into the stratosphere, jumped from the stands out into the diamond with a glove. And he went somewhere, I think, where he would appear to be the shortstop. No joke, he was a comedian, so he pretended to be one of the players. So this very tense moment in Fenway, everything goes quiet, no one knows what to do. You have this midget here pretending to be one of the players, and then suddenly the entire stadium erupts in laughter. And nowadays, they probably would put him in Guantanamo Bay or something, or Abu Ghraib. I mean, he'd be on the Department of Homeland Security list. They simply picked him up, put him in the stands. They appreciated the joke. But Marco's name became very famous overnight. People thought that he had been put up by the Indians to do this. And then later, people would write the Boston Globe and ask, who was the midget that used to play for the Boston Red Sox? And that was my uncle. And so he has a certain small amount of fame. And so I embarked to be a writer and do great things because, as I like to say, I have very small shoes to fill. As all the literature indicated, I'm going to talk a little bit about Bobby Kennedy, Joe Barboza, and a G-man named H. Paul Rico. And before I do that, I'd like to set the stage a little bit. Now, some of you may know more about this than I do, and that's cool. Please pretend that you don't, because it'll crush my ego if you are smarter than I am. But I'd like to point out, up until about 1970, there was no great pervasive myth of the Mafia being some sort of Italian benevolent association. And after 1972, after the blockbuster book by Mario Puzo and the amazing first two movies by Francis Ford Coppola, the Mafia began to be seen as a more upright and moral society than most political bodies, churches, or corporations in America. And it created a myth of some sort of sacred, honorable society. And so I grew up in Boston, and I had family members and friends of my family who were somewhat knowledgeable about this because of the neighborhoods that I grew up in. And the stories I heard about gangsters, sometimes in the Mafia, sometimes affiliated, sometimes in other groups, was quite different. It wasn't necessarily quite the honorable society. It was just, in some cases, very thuggish people doing thuggish things, earning a living as best they could. And so when I began to write this book, which covers a very epic changing period in the 1960s into the early 1970s, I wanted to peel back the onion layers and actually look at what was this organization, the Mafia, and what was it doing in New England, and how did it operate. Now, before I continue, I did do a little research to see if I could somehow connect Vermont to organized crime. It wasn't easy, but back in the 80s, I don't know if you people here followed the organized crime scene in Boston in the 70s and 80s, but during that time it was basically run by a family of men called the Angulos. And I'll get back to them a little bit later, but one of the Angulos was arrested and was facing a pretty severe sentence. So before he had to start doing his time, a letter appeared from the Walcott Elementary School, which I believe is near Barrie. The town's population at this time was about 900 people, and this letter appeared from Vermont to the magistrates asking that this Angulo brother not be forced to do his time. And so as you see, it said that one of the Angulos set up this little group of kids, 22 kids, to spend 5 days in Boston on his tab, send him to a Red Sox game, everything. Now I'm sure it was pure altruism. I'm sure he did not care in the least about the public relations aspect of it. I'm sure that it meant absolutely nothing to him. But a letter was drafted and sent to the magistrate, and as you can see, it says, "You gave new meaning to the words kindness, consideration, generosity," the children told Angulo. "Hard to picture, perhaps, but many of these kids come from the back hills of northern Vermont. They've never been to a big city before. Bless you for helping make it all possible." So, such as it is, I give you the one connection I could comb through to connect these things. It is in the Boston Globe archives. If any of you are curious, I'll be happy to send you the original article, which I found as funny and amusing as almost anything I encountered when I embarked on the book. Excuse me a second. Dry mouth. Now, what I also find very interesting is that for the past 100 years or so, most discussion of American organized crime centers around this very small group shall we say, legally challenged Italian Americans called the Mafia. And there's very little actually known about what the Mafia really was or is. Some people say it goes back into the Middle Ages and that there was this uprising the night of the Sicilian Vespers where French conquerors were dealt with because they had dishonored the honor of Sicilian women. Others say that it was because of the endless occupations of Sicily by various invaders, Normans, Arabs, Greeks, Romans, that this sort of residual culture of resistance appeared called Mafia. And the word Mafia, even in Italian, can mean many things. It can mean place of refuge. It can mean something that's good. It can mean all these different things. Now, I'm certainly not going to propose a full explanation of the Mafia, but I do want to mention that some type of outgrowth of this entered the United States somewhere probably between the 1850s and 1900, and there certainly was a small cadre of men who had an allegiance to each other, were very secretive, did not trust government, and they had a very clear agenda of what they wanted to do. And much of that involved protection in some cases, sometimes taking money to protect people from hurting themselves. In some cases, establishing lotteries, which the Italian communities supported themselves. And this spread mostly throughout the Northeast where the biggest concentrations of the Italian population were. And over 20 to 30 years, because of Prohibition, which denied people alcohol, and because other things were denied them, such as gambling, the Mafia established strangleholds in these things, became a very powerful organization. And I'm going to jump a little bit. By the 1950s, which is where my story begins, the most powerful man in New England crime was this gentleman named Raymond Patriarca. And he was American-born. He was not born in Sicily. He's part of a group of American mafia leaders who had an American way of doing things. They weren't old world. They were very quick to respond with violence. They had powerful political connections. And Raymond ran most of the New England Mafia from a little shabby office, as they called it, in the middle of Providence. And because he did actually have an office, his whole organization was known as the office. And the building's still there. It became a shish kebab place. Now it's not much of anything. But Raymond knew how to blend into his environment in Providence. But anyone that knew anything about him realized he was a very powerful man. He could have people killed, he could have people hurt. Very capable guy. Spent most of his early life in jail. And in 1950, he took over the organization, which gave him control over most of Connecticut, Maine, Boston, Rhode Island. And he was seen as basically a third or fourth arm of government in Rhode Island. And he was so powerful, people once asked him, why did you establish your operations in Providence? And he said, it's easier to corrupt a small state than a big one. So Raymond was this enormously powerful man. His word was law in the underworld. No one could get at him, partially because the Mafia had all these various protocols about swearing allegiance, fear that your family would be harmed if you testified. And also there was the gangster's etiquette that you never turn on a fellow gangster, particularly if he's an Italian. And that was summarized by the Italian word omertà. That sort of changed when this gentleman entered the scene, and he does look a little ridiculous, and there was an element of ridiculousness to him. He was a senator from Arkansas named Estes Kefauver. And up to this point, very little had been made public about this actually very huge organization, very powerful in places like Chicago and New York, called the Mafia. He began to hold public hearings. He called some of the biggest and most important Mafia figures to testify in front of the Senate subcommittee. And even though these weren't regular trials, if you lied, you could be sent to jail for perjury. If you refused to testify, you could be held in contempt. So Kefauver began to cast light onto something that had been extremely closeted. And this changed the whole dynamic of how organized crime operated. It was now seen as a very big national thing. Now, as the title of my discussion indicates, one Kennedy took organized crime very seriously, Bobby Kennedy. And he was noted as being a little different from his brothers for various reasons. He was probably more Catholic, he was probably more pious. He was definitely someone who was willing to be very abrasive. If people crossed him, he would go after them. And he served on the subcommittee that was interrogating these mafia figures. And so he would ask some of the most pointed questions of these powerful mafia men. And he was a young guy, and he did not have, shall we say, the heft maybe of an older man. He was abrasive. He wasn't courteous. And during these hearings, he and Raymond Patriarca began to spar back and forth. And it's said that at the end of one of these discussions, Raymond went up to both, John was senator at the time, and Bobby was the counsel of the subcommittee. It's said that he went up to the brothers and said, "You two don't have the brains of your retarded sister," which I've never been able to find the actual source of this, but this basically was throwing the gauntlet to Bobby, who, to him, family honor, he was very much like the mafia in his own way, was paramount. And Raymond disliked the Kennedys for lots of reasons. For one, they were Democrats, and he was a Democrat. They were Irish, and he resented the power that they wielded over the Italian community. And Raymond didn't realize that he had made a mortal enemy when he insulted Bobby Kennedy, who, and again, after Jack became president, he was made Attorney General. And come the early 1960s, the most powerful lawman in the country is now looking to do something about organized crime. Up to this point, there had been no real concerted effort to take on the mafia. J. Edgar Hoover was more interested in pursuing communists. He basically didn't even acknowledge that there was any type of organization called the Commission, which sort of facilitated and oversaw the operation of organized crime. And Bobby was very willing to start to pursue this. And he gave Hoover very specific instructions to create programs and plans to begin surveillance. In many cases, he demanded microphone surveillance, which was illegal at the time without a warrant. And so one of the things that Bobby said was, "I want to get the pig on the hill." And when he said the pig on the hill, he meant Raymond Patriarca, whose organization, as I mentioned, the office was based on Federal Hill in downtown Providence. So there's a picture of Raymond being called to testify. As you can see, he is camera shy. He's a very intelligent man, and it's hard to imagine anybody that could have gone as far as he did without an education. He had influence in politics, he had influence in business, he had the ability, he could talk to a lieutenant governor, he could talk to a congressman. There was almost nobody he couldn't reach. It's hard to imagine anybody going so far as he did without exceptional gifts as an administrator and as a businessman. But he always denied the existence of the mafia. In one of the interesting stories I heard, and mind you, there was an illegal bug in his headquarters. One of the stories was that if Raymond said that if anyone asked him about the mafia, he'd say it didn't exist. And he was going to say the only mafia he ever heard of was the Irish mafia, which the Kennedys run. And Bobby, of course, saw the transcripts of all these things, and that simply added more fuel to the fire. Now there are the Anjula brothers, whom I mentioned. They ran the rackets in Boston. The gentleman Second, from the left on your side, is Gennaro Angiulo, Jerry Angiulo. He was basically the sort of the capo who was in charge of these operations. And after Estes Kefauver launched his campaign and had his public hearings, Massachusetts and other states began to also call these men who had been in the shadows up forward and force them to testify. So these are the Angiulo brothers in Boston, I believe in 1963, before the Mass Crime Commission. These are men that had never been seen before in public together. The public wasn't even aware at large, they weren't even aware that these men had any sort of affiliation. And if you look at them, they look like they're at a convention of accountants. And to be fair to the Angiulos, they were career criminals, but mostly they dealt with gambling, which was hugely lucrative. And and they kept things within a certain set of boundaries. Now, this gentleman is the G-man mentioned in the title of my presentation. His name was H. Paul Rico, and he came from Boston. He was a unique mix for the time. He was Spanish and Irish, and he had a dark complexion. People called him the Spaniard. He did his stint in the service in World War II, and then he became an FBI man. Very, very capable guy. And what made Rico interesting to me as a person was that he used to adopt the mannerisms of organized criminals. Maybe, you know, like when St. Paul says, I am all things to all men, Rico was that way with mobsters. He could imitate them, he would dress like them, and he was very clever at manipulating them. One mobster said he had a Machiavellian mind. So, come 1961, Rico is given orders through Hoover to the Boston office to really start to push on the Mafia in the greater Boston area, including the Angiulos, including Raymond Patriarca, and break it apart. And again, one of the problems faced was that they couldn't get anyone who would be willing to testify. Now, I will say, I don't really cover Whitey Bulger in my book or anything. I think that's been sort of done to death. But Rico had won fame because he was the person who arrested Bulger in the 50s. He was able to turn an informant who had worked with Bulger bank robbing, and he managed to arrest Bulger. And he was known as a top-notch agent, very capable guy. So you had basically a very clever man. Some said that he was ruthless, that he would stop at nothing while working for the government. And he was taking on this enormously powerful organization, and he had the backing of Bobby Kennedy, who was perhaps the most vindictive and the most committed of all the Kennedy brothers. And he had the full weight of the government behind him, and all he needed to do was find some sort of crack in the armor to defeat the Mafia. And at this point, I'd like to take any questions before I continue, if anyone has anything that they want to ask about or have me elaborate on. Okay?
Who is this person?
That's Rico in a slightly later age. As you can see, he liked to dress well. He liked fancy hair. He was, some people have said that he was the most corrupt FBI agent in the FBI's history, which I don't buy into that. Rico was given a task. No one had brought a major case against a Mafia figure in New England. And Rico, I would say, may have been somewhat corrupt, but he viewed what he did as necessary to fulfill the government's mission. And again, Bobby Kennedy was pushing this, pushing it against Raymond Patriarca in particular. And Rico, one of the things that he was known for, he would go to known organized criminals' hangouts, and he would befriend them. He would talk to them. He claimed that he had the original head of the Winter Hill Gang, Buddy McLean, as one of his informants, or at least as one of his associates. He claimed that he had Stevie Fleming, who was very famous now because he was Whitey Bulger's compatriot, that he had turned him as a top echelon informant. So he had a stable of very well-known criminals, people that people in the criminal world themselves would never believe would ever be informants. Rico had the ability to turn them and they trusted him. He had the ability to create a sense of trust with men that were very dangerous, men that if even a whisper that they were cooperating with the FBI escaped, they knew that they would be assassinated. So that sets the stage for Rico, and that's kind of a Machiavellian smile for a Machiavellian guy. So that's Rico when he was a bit older, I think probably around the time of his retirement. But I'd like to emphasize that while I think that his methods were off, and some of the people in organized crime that I know tell me that he was somewhat corrupt, he was basically fulfilling the mandates he was given to fulfill. Yes, sir, please.
Do you have any understanding or theories why Hoover pretended the Mafia didn't exist?
Too difficult to attack. I mean, he was able to, I mean, two of the things that Hoover pursued were high-profile bank robbers. That was in the 20s and 30s. And this is a story which never verified, but it said that when Hoover knew he was going to take down a big bank robber like Dillinger or Pretty Boy Floyd, if he knew that the arrest was in the offing, he would bump that particular crook up to public enemy number one. So, you know, some of these guys were just fairly pathetic clowns who were very brash. They were dangerous, but they were criminally inept, but they generated headlines. So Hoover took, in a lot of ways, the easy way to get attention. He was the ultimate careerist. He knew that if he could get these high-profile cases, that he could get bigger budgets, that he would get more respect. In a lot of ways, he was a terrible lawman. I mean, in a lot of ways, he was, you know, he persecuted harmless communists who, whether or not we agree or disagree with communism, these were people that was their political belief. He hounded them as much as he could, and in some cases destroyed their lives. And here's something that I discovered about Hoover. Hoover would throw men, capable men, like Rico, and Rico had his associates in the Boston office. He would throw men at a project. They would follow Raymond Patriarca all day long, week after week. They followed him. His wife had to have surgery in Boston. So agents round the clock watched everybody Raymond met at the hospital. They even got the doctor's report on Raymond's wife, which nowadays would be illegal under HIPAA, but I'm sure the Patriot Act would circumvent it. So they even talked to the doctors about what Raymond's wife's problem was. And they cross-referenced everybody. They referred to files that existed in everybody that met with Raymond. And round the clock, they just compiled more and more information. In fact, there was Rocky Marciano had a beautiful fur coat stolen. And Rocky was the most famous Italian-American in the world back in the early 60s. And he wanted to go to see Raymond because he figured Raymond could pull strings and get the jacket back. He was told, please don't go to see Raymond in person. It would just be too much. So an emissary went down and asked Raymond, can you help us find this fur coat? So Raymond said, sure, I'll give him a hand. Rocky's a friend of mine. So to give you an idea of the way Hoover operated, he would accumulate endless facts about people. He would find about their personal habits, their finances. These agents would call credit agencies. These agents would call business associates. The agents would call ex-wives. These agents would approach the friends of Raymond's wife to interview her. They stopped at nothing to collect information, most of which just sat in files and did nothing. So you would have mountains of data that Hoover could pick through, and even if he couldn't use it in court, and even if it wasn't directly connected with the case, a person's sexual peccadillos or financial transactions, Hoover could just use the threat of making that public to coerce people. He didn't even have to take you to court. So what I would say is Hoover took what to him was the path of least resistance. Instead of making, you know, powerful cases, and in fact the FBI was more of a guidance agency. What they would do is they would collect evidence and they would give it to local law enforcement. In some cases it could be on the state level, sometimes it was the federal level. They themselves wouldn't necessarily make the case, it would be handed over to the various prosecutors. So they acted almost as an advisory body in some ways. But what Hoover did was he simply created an agency that could do whatever it wanted, and whatever personal whatever group or cause that Hoover may not have liked, he could pursue it. So that's why he didn't necessarily go after the Mafia. And he didn't necessarily see the Mafia as being a bigger threat to the American way of life than communism. Keep in mind, he was this, I guess, sort of simple Kansas sort of fellow, and probably didn't interact too much with the Mafia, but the idea of a communist was probably far more frightening, and also probably got a lot more headlines. So that's my thinking, that Hoover simply did what he found was easy to do, and things that were to his personal taste, and that's why this developed. And then when Robert Kennedy gets into office, he, as many people know, when the Senate held hearings on organized crime's influence in unions, Bobby took this to heart, even though the core of support for the Democratic Party was organized labor, and he, it was almost like Captain Ahab pursuing Jimmy Hoffa to bring him down. And as an adjunct to that, he also wanted to bring down the Mafia, who had infiltrated the unions, and he didn't care what the cost was. So Hoover went with the path of least resistance. And of course, I didn't mention the famous meeting, I believe it was 1959 in Appalachia, New York, where there was this big conference of Mafia leaders from all over the country. The New York State Police broke it, and suddenly Hoover's confronted very publicly with the fact there is a bunch of guys with vowels running through their names who are involved in all these unsavory activities, and he has to deal with it. So that's my thing, that lazy lawman, personal peccadillos, and then he's forced to confront this by Bobby Kennedy, whom he never really liked. Bobby was a very strident fellow. I'm sorry, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, two questions. Was the RICO Act named after him, or was that just a coincidence?
Mere coincidence. RICO is racketeering and corrupt influences. RICO, that was just his Spanish name. Interesting enough, all right, RICO was devised by a lawyer named Blakely, who I believe worked for Bobby Kennedy when Kennedy was the Attorney General. And because one of the problems with breaking the Mafia was that most of the crimes, even extortion and gambling, they carried virtually minimal penalties. If you were caught gambling or running a numbers operation, you might get a $100 fine and 2 weeks in jail. With RICO, which was created, I believe, in the early 70s, now you could be indicted simply for being part of an organization that plans a crime, and then the penalties start 5, 10, 15, 20 years for each thing you do as part of that group. But purely coincidence.
The other question, which is more contemporary, what happened to Cadillac Frank?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
But I will say I believe he is alive, but we'll get to that. Please?
What did the young man, Raymond, do to gather enough power to become such a major mob boss?
Raymond was born in the early 1900s, and he came from a good family, actually. His father was a wine clerk in Providence, and then when Prohibition started, he stayed in the business, but illegally, and he did pretty well as a bootlegger. And Raymond came of age when people were making huge fortunes. If people have watched Boardwalk Empire, or there's any number of books and movies about the Roaring '20s and about how much money could be made. The '80s, it was cocaine in Florida, but back in the '20s, huge amounts of money could be made selling illegal liquor. So Raymond, when he was, I believe, 16, his father died, and Raymond took to the streets, and he started some. It's hard to say what made him do this, because in a lot of ways Raymond was a very middle-class guy. He did not like being associated with unsavory things. He didn't like drugs. He didn't like people in his organization dealing in drugs. When he heard that someone had broken into a Catholic high school and stolen all the typewriters, he got a call from the Archbishop screaming at him. And Raymond said, I'll try and get you the typewriters. And Raymond thought that was a very low-class thing to do. He was not amoral. So Raymond, in a lot of ways, was brought up in a traditional Catholic family, very close, very tight, but he became a public enemy #1 Mostly, first, of course, as I mentioned, he was involved in bootlegging, even though he didn't drink, he had diabetes. And then later, he became famous as a jewelry thief. And at that time, and to some degree today, the high end of armed robbery was stealing jewelry or gold, because these were small items that could be converted to cash, very liquid stuff. And so Raymond was famous for very brazen robberies. He tried to take out, there was a place in Massachusetts, United Optical, and they used to make very expensive frames for glasses. And Raymond was actually caught having broken into this place with a weapon just after he had robbed a jeweler in Brookline, Massachusetts. So he was a very brazen, he would try different things, anything to make money. And so because he was bold, because he never became an informant, because he basically spent the first half of his life in jail, he was seen as a man to be respected. And probably around 1928, there was a small branch of the Mafia in Providence. It appears that that was when he was brought to New York, which was the whole center of the Mafia, and inducted and became a made member of the society. And this conjunction of things is why Raymond was seen as an up-and-comer. Now Raymond, very briefly, he wound up, he basically bought a pardon for himself from the Governor's Council. You may have heard about one of the Wahlberg brothers trying to get the Governor's Council in Massachusetts to expunge his record. Well, the Governor's Council has the power of commutation, of cleaning out records. Raymond was able to basically get his record, his sentence for these violent crimes just eliminated, and he was released. So this became a cause célèbre. Raymond became the most famous gangster in the country very briefly because police had to bring him back from Miami. He had just been married, and they revived indictments against him, and then he faced serious time, and again, which he served. And so here you now have a very famous man who has been in the public eye. He hasn't turned, he's done his time, and he's very dangerous. And a lot of the early crimes Raymond was associated with did involve murder and other things. And he's a very clever man, he's very smart. And right around 1950, the man who ran the Boston Mafia, Filippo Buccola, he wanted to retire and return to Sicily. And he had taken a shine to Raymond, and he proposed Raymond as his successor. And that required Raymond to be rebaptized into the Boston family as opposed to the New York, Rhode Island family. And with that promotion, he took over all the apparatus that had been set up for the past 30, 40 years. As I mentioned, the men who basically created the Mafia, they were almost always from Italy or Sicily. They came over between 1890 and about 1910, and they infiltrated different places, almost always starting in New York and then moving out to places like Boston, Portland, Maine, Hartford, Connecticut. They spread out, and they kept this nucleus of an organization together. And that's what Raymond inherited, and he built on that and expanded it. So that's how Raymond became so powerful. And he was a very charismatic guy. He was well-spoken, he was funny, he had charm. People who met him found he was anything but what they thought a Mafia Don would be like. He had a very disarming way about him. And as I said, he was very soft-spoken. And in his own way, he was an honorable man. People who did business with him, not outsiders, but people in that group. Raymond even said that the most important thing is trust and honor, and the worst thing you can do is steal from a friend. So in his group, he was seen as a guy who, if he had to do a life sentence and not turn in an associate, he would do that. He had proven it. So that's how it became powerful. That reputation amounts to actual street cred. Please.
Did anyone see the cracks and see him for what he was, and was there protection for him? Like, was anyone after him? Rico.
We'll get to that, actually. Any other questions before I proceed? So, now, I want to set the stage a little bit, the underworld that Rico stepped into. As I mentioned, he would go around and he would visit criminals like Frankie Salemi, Frankie Salemi, Cadillac Frank, as he was called because he liked to ride Cadillacs, it's true. Criminals have told me that when he was a young man, he actually liked to tool around in Roxbury in his Cadillacs. He had a couple of shops in Roxbury, and he worked with Stevie the Rifleman Fleming. They were partners, they had different things going on, and Rico would go around to the garage and just chat with him and drop little hints and see what he could learn. And at the same time, I'm sure you've all heard of the Winter Hill Gang, but in the early 1960s, there simply was no Winter Hill Gang as such. It was just a little place called Winter Hill, which really is just a hill, and it's a section of Somerville, and a small group of gangsters who were really gangsters as a hobby. Most of them were truck drivers or stevedores or carpenters. They would do side jobs. They would run numbers. They would rob banks. The thing about the Winter Hill Gang, it was founded by a man named James Buddy McLean. He was a truck driver. He used to haul fish. He was a lumper, as they used to say. And so his specialty, the specialty of his group, was moving hijacked stuff. But this was just a sideline. Again, it was a hobby for them. So Rico would go to Winter Hill, and at the time Winter Hill was involved in, and this is Buddy McLean, he was the founder of the gang. They used to say of him that he looked like a choir boy, but he fought like the devil. He was known as the toughest street fighter in Somerville. He wasn't, where you have a guy like Whitey Bulger terrifying everybody, Buddy, like his name indicates, was someone everybody loved. Nice guy. He was only a bad guy if you crossed him in matters of business, or if you challenged him, and then it would be a fight almost to the death. And Buddy had created this little nucleus, as I mentioned, in Somerville, running some numbers, and Rico used to reach out to him. Now, it's debatable how much information Buddy ever gave, because Buddy did not like rats, but he may have had some sort of friendly, collegial kind of relationship with Rico and Rico's partner, Dennis Condon. Now, this guy who looks like Costello, I believe that's his name, was Georgie McLaughlin. And he was one of the leaders of a rival gang in Charlestown. And if you look at the map of Boston, Charlestown and Somerville are adjacent. I won't get into all the details, but because Georgie made a pass at the wrong woman, he got beaten almost to death, and he wanted revenge for the people that beat him, and they happened to be very good friends of Buddy McLean. Buddy refused to assist, so one of Georgie's brothers tried to blow up Buddy's family, which prompted the most violent gang war in New England history, which lasted from 1961 to about 1966, depending on how you actually tally it. So Rico comes into the middle of this massive gang war, and he's looking to manipulate people on either side of this conflict. He did not like the McLaughlins. He found them pretty crazy, and they were. But he found that he could do a little work with people like Buddy. So, as you can see, this was very serious stuff. As I mentioned, 20, 30, 40 maybe people were murdered. That's a picture of Bernie McLaughlin. Buddy caught him planting dynamite in his car, which the next day, his wife was going to take the car, it would have blown up his entire family. Buddy didn't like this, and as they said, no one has ever hit Buddy without getting hit back. So again, this terrible Irish gang feud. Now, one thing that the FBI was very good at, as I said, was finding informants. So Georgie, for reasons of his own, killed an innocent person at a party. Apparently he mistook him for someone he had been arguing with over a beer bottle, and he killed this young bank clerk and then went into hiding. The FBI was able to develop sources through Rico, I believe, as well as his partner Condon, and they had this very splashy arrest of Georgie. So you can see where the FBI is making inroads in the Irish gangsters, but it still can't quite get to the Mafia. In the middle of this gang war, this man was assassinated named Teddy Deegan. Joe Barboza, who I've only indirectly mentioned, was involved in setting up this assassination for reasons which still aren't clear. But this became a linchpin for all the things that Rico and the FBI would do with the justice system that had brought it so much notoriety. Now let me jump, this is young Joe Barboza. He was born 1932. Basically, he had a tattoo on his arm that said "Born to Lose," and he never failed to live up to it. By the time he was 17, he was doing hard time for stealing. Came from a broken family in New Bedford, a very hard case. And while he's doing something like a 10-year sentence, he breaks out of jail very violently out of Concord, Massachusetts, goes on a brief spree, kidnaps people, beats people, and he winds up getting rearrested, and now he's given a sentence of something like another 10 years, and now it's not even in a halfway medium security prison. He's in Charlestown State Penitentiary, which is a terrible, terrible place. So Joe, basically from a young age, has been put in the animal factory of Massachusetts. Extremely violent man. There he is a little later. You can see that his demeanor had not improved. He gets out of jail in the early 60s. He becomes very famous for his violence. He claims to have killed 26 people, delivered something like 500 beatings, 300 stabbings. He thought it was great. He bragged about it. He was very proud of his abilities at hurting people. And at that time, because the Mafia had such a powerful hold on most of the levers of organized crime, Joe knew that to rise in the underworld, he would have to, at some point, unite with the Mafia. And so he would do free jobs for the mob. One of his first tasks, he claimed, was to beat an independent bookmaker with a banister at Suffolk Downs racetrack. He didn't have any other objects, so he just grabbed a banister and hit the person. And this was how he started his mob enforcement career. And he was known as a reliable, in terms of actually hurting or killing the victim. He wasn't very good at hiding the bodies or anything. He used to just leave them lying behind them. He was, as you could see, the look, he weighed about 200 pounds. He was about 5'10". They used to call him No Neck because he had such a beefy neck. Very, very violent guy. He would beat, bite, shoot, anything that stood in his way. And so Joe created a small criminal outfit of his own out of East Boston, and he had his own reign of terror. And he continued to get better and better contracts until he got the contract, as he claimed, to kill Teddy Deegan, and which they finally did. And they had passed in Massachusetts what was known as a habitual criminal offender law, which is similar to RICO, that if you had committed a certain number of crimes, you would now be punished for the crimes, the fact of the crimes themselves, not the actual specifics. So Joe was picked up in Boston in 1966, and after all this long reign of terror, they had Joe with an M1 rifle and all these other weapons, and he's now facing an 84-year habitual offender sentence. At the same time, Joe's minions start to go around to collect money to bail him out. He had a $100,000 bail, enormous amount of money that had to be raised, and his acolytes began to actually pressure the Mafia itself to give them the money for the bail, which did not sit right with people. So all of a sudden, the Mafia starts to eliminate Joe's crew, one after the other. And Joe, who hated rats and informants, suddenly realizes that he himself is targeted for assassination. He's no longer favored by Raymond, and at some point, it's not clear exactly how or when, he and Paul Rico met at Walpole Prison, and Joe offered to testify, and basically offered anybody that Rico wanted. So this deal is struck.
So he knows who Rico is at this point?
He met Rico, oh yes. I mean, Rico got around, but what's interesting is, as I mentioned, Rico Rico had extensive reports, which are available now. They've been declassified. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of reports. He would go around and just pick up tidbits and facts about what was going on in the underworld. And in fact, days before Teddy Deegan was assassinated, Rico knew about it, and he even sent the information to J. Edgar Hoover, but they didn't do anything about it to prevent it. I mean, this is a frequent thing that appears in the FBI's record, that they would get notice that someone is about to be assassinated in the underworld, and they do nothing. In Rico's case, some people think that he would sit on information and let people be killed because he wanted them to be killed. There was one instance, I don't have the slide, but there was one criminal named Richard Darmody, and he was arrested with Whitey Bulger. He was a bank robber. And Darmody did jail time. During the gang war, when he got out, he was approached by the McLaughlin brothers. They wanted him to kill Buddy McLean. He tried, failed, and then he reached out to Rico to help because he knew that Buddy McLean would assassinate him. And according to Frankie Salemi, Rico arranged to meet with Darmody, and when Darmody approached the car that Rico was in, Buddy McLean was there, and he shot him to death. So those are some of the stories that have come up with Rico, that he for whatever reason, if he decided a gangster had outlived their usefulness, he would eliminate them or have them eliminated. And in fact, I showed you the slide where Georgie McLaughlin was arrested for murder. Frankie Salemi and Stevie Fleming both said that before the arrest, Rico went to their garage and said that he wanted a clean gun that he was going to use, and he said, if I get the chance, I'm going to bang Georgie. He's going to just kill him, execute him, because he don't like him. And so they gave him the gun, which was not traceable, and it turned out that they arrested Georgie. He survived the arrest, and Rico came back to the garage, and he looked very glum, and they wanted to know, well, why didn't you kill Georgie? Because they hated him too. And he said that 3 out of the 4 FBI agents in the arrest agreed they would kill Georgie, but one held out and they couldn't take the risk that he would testify. So these are the stories about Rico that circulated. They came to light about 10 years ago. So my point is that Rico could be a very ruthless man, very much like a gangster himself in his methods. Now, he still couldn't get a good witness, but he cultivated Joe Barboza, and Barboza brought 1 or 2 other people to assist him in some of his testimony. As you can see, Joe didn't much care for publicity. He had a love-hate relationship with it. Now, at this point, Bobby Kennedy had left the Justice Department, and he was now a senator. And he was one of the architects of the Witness Protection Program. And he actually approached a Rhode Island lawman named John Partington, who was this gentleman here, and who is a federal marshal. And he asked him if he would be part of this new witness protection program where you would take a witness, someone very high in organized crime, not just a petty lowlife, but someone who actually had knowledge of the inner workings of the executives, and take him and put him in a safe place with his family so that he would be very cooperative, give him immunity, and then give him a new life. And Partington accepted the task. And Partington basically was the architect of the protection part of witness protection. And Joe Barboza was his very first ward. As I mentioned before, there had never been an underworld witness like Joe, who had taken orders directly from the top brass of the Mafia to actually kill or hurt people. Joe was the first one. And because of the power of the Mafia at the time, especially in Rhode Island, they had to hide Joe in various places. And one of the places where they put Joe and his wife and his daughter was this place called Thatcher's Island, which is off of Gloucester, Massachusetts. And Joe described it as a hellhole full of rattlesnakes and full of holes and gullies. It had 2 automated lighthouses and a squadron of U.S. Marshals, and that's where they hid Joe. And basically, it was an armed camp. And because of, now, I didn't mention that Rico had developed such a network of informants. One of the problems with Raymond Tracherico was that he did not pay his help very well. And there were a number of people that would give for $20 or $30 a pop tips on what was going on. And one of them was someone who became very famous named Fat Vinnie Teresa. And Vinnie Teresa was present as a gopher at many of the top meetings of the mob in Providence. And to give you, for instance, Rico learned from Vinnie Teresa that the mob had discovered that Joe was hiding on Thatcher's Island, and that they were going to send a hitman named Pro Learner who was going to use a sniper scope and pick Joe off from a boat. And Vinnie Teresa immediately told Rico, and Rico told Partington. So Partington had Joe dress up like a marshal and had everyone put on hoods on their heads and put them all outside with carbines just to scare off the attempt, which was never made. That was done on Halloween. So that night, just in an act of defiance, to let Joe's daughter go to the barracks of the marshals for trick-or-treating. So that shows you all the things, some of the things that Rico was involved with. Rico, as I mentioned, he also cultivated Stevie the Rifleman Fleming, made him a top echelon informant. And Stevie's brother was best friends with Joe. And so Rico could plant ideas in Joe's head and find out what Joe was thinking through all these different channels. And he manipulated, and I have to skim over because it was very complicated, but he manipulated all the players beautifully and wound up getting them all into court. Now, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Did the Mafia know that Rico was FBI?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. No, they never touched Lawman. You just didn't do it. That's when people will start getting shot while resisting arrest or hanging themselves in their cells. There are things you just don't do. And that's one of them. You don't touch directly Lawman. But the other thing is, Rico had access to almost every source of private information the Mafia had. Rico would either hear about it through transcripts, the wiretaps, which were in a number of the headquarters of the New England mob, or he would get it through his informants. So Rico would hear about a threat, and he could use 2 or 3 means to counter that threat without the Mafia even knowing it. So, when you think about what Rico did, and he wasn't alone, he had FBI partners, he was really quite brilliant, and he brought 3 major cases against the mob. Raymond was indicted, and then he was convicted. Jerry and Jula was nearly convicted. He beat that by a whisker. His right-hand man, Henry Tamilio, was both sentenced for 5 years, and he was given the death penalty in the Deegan case. Basically, using Joe, Rico and the FBI was able to eliminate the whole top hierarchy of the New England mob. And I just mentioned this, and this is the only somewhat gory picture because it's very public. In the middle of all these trials, when Joe heard that Bobby Kennedy had been assassinated, he went into a huge gloom. Now, Joe was a very violent, nasty guy. There were very few people that Joe liked or could stand. And Joe knew that Bobby Kennedy basically had saved him by creating the Witness Protection Program. And when Joe found out that Kennedy was dead, they said that he, in his hiding place, he just went into a huge sulk, a huge gloom, didn't know how these criminal trials would proceed. And John Partington went into a depression because he liked Kennedy. And again, Kennedy had solicited his assistance to create the Witness Protection Program. He had wanted to be Kennedy's bodyguard the very night that he was assassinated. So Partington felt very bad about this. So, but I showed this slide because Joe aside, Joe was basically the test case for the Witness Protection Program, and that became the single most powerful thing that eliminated organized crime as a major force as we know it in the United States, because they could always get to you by taking your most trusted advisor or a family member, turning them and hiding them, and Joe was the very first person they did this with, and that was in large part the brainchild of Kennedy, and that was done by, assisted by Rico, who used to visit Joe constantly and cultivated him, and implemented by Partington. Someone had a question, please?
Maybe I misunderstood, but you said no, there'd never been an informant before like Joe?
Witness.
A witness, because what about this Valachi guy back in the...
Sure, sure.
Was he was killed, wasn't he?
No.
He wasn't?
You bring up an excellent point. Valachi was a fairly low-level member of the Gambino family in New York. And he was doing time for dealing drugs, which allegedly was a death sentence. And Gambino, no, I'm sorry, it wasn't Gambino, it was Vito Genovese, I'm sorry. Genovese, a very violent guy, very scary guy. And Valachi, who knew very little of the top echelon of New York, knew some things. And he murdered a man who he thought was Genovese in jail in Atlanta. He killed him with a pipe because he thought that Genovese was going to kill him. Genovese is a very scary guy. So he offered to give up all the facts that he knew. And again, we're getting back to Estes Kefauver and all these subcommittees of the Senate holding hearings about the mob. Valachi, in 1962 or 63, he was the first guy who claimed to actually have been inducted to the Mafia who discussed it. But they never really built any cases off of the things that he had to say. And in fact, Genovese went to jail because of things like tax evasion, because when he was divorcing his wife, she basically said her husband had this alternate lifestyle where there was enormous income that he hadn't reported, and that put him in jail. So he wasn't even put away for the more notorious crimes. So Valachi in particular, Valachi was what Bobby Kennedy didn't want. A man who was taken out of jail and put into another jail, and he died, I think, in Latuna, Texas, kind of a broken, lonely man. Kennedy envisioned something where instead of getting this sort of this fringe player who sort of cooperates, you get someone who's willing to give it all up in return for immunity and a chance to have another life. With Valachi, he died in jail. And so Valachi, it's not clear that Valachi said anything people didn't really know about or how accurate it was, but it was the first time it had been so public. People saw his face, heard his voice, and that really stuck. Valachi had these fanciful tales about this huge gang war in the 20s where all the old mustache Petes were killed across the country, which just never happened. There were a lot of things that Valachi said he just either made up to please the people, the FBI, or because he had heard it second or third hand. So Valachi was sort of the prototype of what Kennedy decided he wanted, and that first person was Barboza, someone who actually sat, executed the contracts, and could put people in places. Now the problem was, Barboza had axes to grind against a lot of his old friends. So some people he put in crimes that they weren't there, particularly in the Deegan matter. And this man here, Henry Tamalio, Joe claimed he loved him like a father. He was Raymond Patriarcha's right-hand man. He was probably even more powerful than Raymond in his own way, a very slick, smooth guy. And Joe claimed he loved Henry like his own father. And when the Mafia turned against him, Joe particularly wanted to bring Henry down. So he put him in the middle of the Deegan murder as having signed off on it. And he was convicted, and he was given the death penalty, which was never executed on him. But this shows you the level of people that Joe was able to bring down. I'm sorry, were there other questions? Okay. Now, Joe even turned against this guy. His name was Ronnie Cassesso. He was from Somerville. He was Joe's partner. And Joe also, Joe accused him of being involved in the Deegan murder, which he was. And he also got the death penalty. And Raymond, these are his later mugshots. Raymond wound up in his mid-50s being arrested again and again, going to jail. He was indicted, fined, and what wound up happening was Raymond, from 1967 on, was in and out of jail till he died about 20 years later. He never recovered the prestige that he had lost by going to jail. There was a lot of resentment about Raymond and Henry for having brought Joe into the organization. All the stories of the wiretaps really made them anathema to a lot of the other Mafia members, that these New England guys had allowed the organization to be so penetrated. And the ironic thing was, Raymond, obviously he was a New Englander, but he was very intimate with the commission in New York. He had even been proposed to become a member of it. Raymond used to brag that he had called all the shots in the commission for 20 years. He was a respected guy, and by the time he was in his 50s, he was seen as possibly the most elder statesman after Frank Costello, who had been his partner. And so going from being the most respected elder statesman of the Mafia to being someone whose organization is riddled with wiretaps and with traitors, Raymond didn't even know if the Mafia was going to depose him as head of New England, and he didn't know if someone was going to try and kill him because of his perceived ineptness. Now, Joe went in the witness protection program, and he wound up immediately going back into crime. He was sent to, originally he wanted to go to, the FBI wanted to send him to Australia when he was done with all this testifying. Believe it or not. And Joe claimed, because he had 2 German Shepherds, they would accept him, a guy who had killed 26 people, but they wouldn't accept his German Shepherds for whatever reason of transporting dogs. And Hoover was okay with this. Hoover was, sure, send this sociopath to Australia. Maybe, he won't help it, but certainly won't hurt it. Who knows what the thinking was. So Joe couldn't bring his dogs, so instead they sent Joe to this little town in California called Santa Rosa. And while Joe was there, he didn't just want to have the life of an ordinary citizen. He wanted a lot of money. He thought the government should pay him for putting all these people away. The government should take care of him. He wanted plastic surgery, which is kind of self-explanatory, not only because of aesthetic reasons, but because Joe was very highly recognizable. Partington said of him, he had a Neanderthal look, which is true. So Joe actually gave interviews after he entered the witness protection program. This is from a Boston affiliate, and he talked at length, and he refused really to stay put. So he wound up getting involved with a biker in California. They were moving stolen guns. They had hundreds of thousands of dollars of stolen securities. And Joe came back east, and he told the Mafia through an intermediary he would be willing to recant his testimony for $1 million. So now, after putting all these guys away for life, now Joe comes back, and he's going to admit that he lied, at least in some of the cases. Now, personally, I will say that the people that he put away, none of them, shall we say, were upstanding citizens. Some of them certainly did not deserve to be indicted for the things they were. They were all, at the very least, shady people. But the law does have to have a standard which is almost superhuman to be trusted. And so Joe had put some of the right people away, and he had put some of the right people away, but for the wrong reasons. So he was willing to come clean in that. And so he came back to Massachusetts, and he's negotiating to recant. And it turns out he gets his offer. He goes back to California, and he kills his partner, the biker, in front of the partner's wife and another witness, and he buries the wife. And then he winds up coming back east and bragging about it. So already Joe is basically sowing the seeds of his own destruction. And he hired as his, well, actually, the attorney assigned to help him in the recantation was F. Lee Bailey, who had represented Joe years before. And a quick anecdote, when Bailey first met Joe, Bailey said he immediately disliked him. And Joe showed up with 2 of the gangsters, a guy named Wimpy Bennett and Howie Winter of the Winter Hill Gang. And Joe refused to take his hat off in Bailey's office. And Bailey demanded he remove the hat. And he asked why did he have to take his hat off if Wimpy Bennett didn't take his hat off. And Bailey said Wimpy's bald, so he can leave his hat on. This is the level of pettiness. So Joe got flustered. And so Bailey kept a pistol in his drawer, as he said, just for such unruly clients as him. He grabbed his pistol and was ready to shoot Joe when Joe got up and started to weep and left the room. Then he came back, banged his hand on the desk and said, "I'm not one of the robots in your office," and they sort of reconciled. But Bailey never liked Barboza. But now, several years later, Bailey is hired to handle this recantation, which would make Bailey, to get 5 or 6 men off of death row, would have been one of the most enormous coups for his entire career. So Joe wound up, during race riots in 1970 in New Bedford, his hometown, Joe wound up brandishing a weapon at some black youths in a car, and he was arrested. And it said, a New Bedford police officer told me that the officer who pulled Joe over, the people he had threatened, had called in his license plate, and they immediately recognized it was Joe Barboza. It was supposed to be in witness protection. And he has an M1 rifle, pistols, marijuana. The officer told Joe, "If you move, I'll blow your brains out." So Joe said, "Have you ever seen brains blown out?" And Joe claimed he had been sent there by the government to handle race relations. So needless to say, Joe winds up going back to jail in Walpole. And so, one other anecdote about Joe, and I know our time is starting to come to an end, but to give you an idea what Joe was like, when he saw Henry Tamilio, he was stuck in the same place as all the people he'd put away. He was in isolated protection. And he saw Henry, and he said, "Henry, I swear on my children's souls, I'm sorry for lying. The government brainwashed me. I'll do whatever it takes to recant and get you out of this. And if I don't, kill my brother Donald." So one of Joe's friends who was there, his cellmate, said, "Well, you put them in a bind. What if you don't get these guys sprung?" He said, "Oh, to hell with Donald. Donald's a jerk. He owes me $600. That was Joe's response. And I paraphrased it because Joe was a little cruder. It gives you an idea of the sort of fellow Joe was. So Joe, in the middle of all this, was basically threatened that he would have to do the 84-year sentence that had been suspended after he gave testimony. So Joe threatened his cell partner, William Garraway, who shared a cell in isolation. They were on the same cell block. Joe threatened to kill him and his family over some argument. So this man gave Joe up for the murders back in California. Joe was indicted for them. He wound up going to jail for them. Again, the FBI, Rico and Condon intervened. The government intervened to lessen Joe's sentence, which would have been normally a capital murder case, but they plea bargained it down to second-degree murder. And so Joe wound up going into the California prison system, the third prison system he had been in yet. And so in 1972, he gave testimony in front of Congress looking like that, talking about the power of organized crime in sports, something he knew absolutely nothing about. But as he admitted, it got him out of jail for a little while. So when he went up to give testimony, as you can see, he was dressed like this. He had a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And when he was asked to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, he said, "I do," without even removing the cigarette from his lips. So, oddly enough, Raymond Patriarca testified after Joe did, and Raymond said that that Joe, he scares me. He's a nutcake. He'll say anything to stay out of jail. And Raymond had a very funny line. The Godfather had come out and was very famous, and one of the senators, or actually congressmen, asked Raymond what he thought of it. And he said it was a pretty good book, but I could come out with the Patriarca papers next week too. And again, there's Joe giving his testimony. People were astonished at this guy, his appearance, the way he spoke. He'd blown his own cover. He had been anonymous in California, so he was sent to a Montana prison camp where he got to ride horses and cook for a field crew. And eventually he was paroled and assassinated in California in 1976. He was betrayed by one of his oldest friends who gave him up to the Mafia. Now here's Raymond as an older man. As I mentioned before, after Barboza put him away, he never regained the power or prestige that he had. When he died, I believe in 1981, he was 71 or 72, and he was facing one indictment after the other. He died a very hounded, unhappy man. And again, there's Raymond complaining about how he'd been treated. And actually, a little anecdote. Joe claimed that Raymond had been partners with Frank Sinatra in a racetrack in the Berkshires, which was true. They actually did have some sort of a partnership. And this so angered Sinatra to have his name connected at all with this. He was, when he was told to appear before this subcommittee, he finally did in his own time. And he complained and said, "You let that bum go running off at the mouth about me. Well, I'm not a second-class citizen." And basically, they defunded that commission. It never existed again. Barboza killed it. Now, because of the Mafia's demise, effective demise, people like Whitey Bulger, and that's him as a young man, stepped in. And again, there's a guy that Rico had arrested, put away. He had some affiliations with the Bulger family. It's a much bigger topic than I want to broach about how the connections between the FBI and Bulger and some of the other underworld figures in Boston mushroomed out to become very heinous things. And there's Stevie the Rifleman Fleming, who was Bulger's partner, but actually, if you look at the history of Stevie Fleming, he lasted longer, stayed out of jail much longer, had as much power and at least as much prestige, and all through that time he had been an FBI informant. And this is before Bulger was even in the picture. Now, the legacy of all this was that this Raymond's son, Junior Patriarca, he was undone by yet another infiltrator. The family itself fractured in the late 80s. When Raymond Jr. became the Don, there were people that didn't like this. They tried to kill his associates like Frankie Salemi, and they began to try and baptize more people into the Mafia, and it backfired because it was wiretapped, because there were insiders that had given it up. And basically with that, the organized crime, the Mafia's organized crime force is gone. And this is Frankie Salemi, who he wound up actually becoming a government witness. He testified before Congress, a guy who had been a right-hand man of Raymond Jr. When he found out that he had been so badly betrayed by Stevie Fleming, he gave up everything he could on him and probably threw in some things that weren't even so. The last that's been heard of him is that he's alive. He was seen at Jerry and Julio's funeral 3 or 4 years ago. So my understanding is he's still alive. I don't think he has much to do with organized crime to the degree it exists anymore. But again, part of the whole legacy of Rico, the FBI, Barboza, all these things sort of coalesced to create this enormous scandal which blew up in the Whitey Bulger era. And again, there's another picture of Junior being photographed. He didn't know it by the FBI. And as a coda to this, some 10 years ago, Rico was called before Congress to testify. The convictions of some of the men who had been put away, Louis Greco, who was completely innocent, Henry Tamelia, who was innocent of killing Deegan or having anything to do with it, same with Joe Salvati and Peter Lamoni. These men were freed, or their names were cleared because of testimony and documents released that had been suppressed. The government had to pay $100 million to them or their families, reparations, and completely disgraced the FBI, made it a laughingstock. And here we see Fleming in his current career. He's doing life. He'll never get out. He's in his 70s. His family's repudiated him for actually killing his own stepdaughter, and endless string of crimes that Rico and the FBI overlooked so that they could fight the Mafia. So there's this whole big picture. I suppose it starts off with the intention of doing a very good thing to fight a very powerful force, and perhaps somewhere over the years the mission gets lost, and with Agent John Connolly taking over from Dennis Condon and H. Paul Rico, he ceases to realize the boundary that needs to exist between a lawman and a criminal, and sort of becomes the criminal's puppet instead of the other way around. And terrible legacy that eventually developed, and it pretty much started back in the 60s with Rico, Barboza, and indirectly Bobby Kennedy. And As you can see, Justice got a very big black eye over the whole thing. And I'm sorry, people had some questions? Any other questions? Please.
So what's the extent of organized crime today? Is there any in Boston?
From what I see, what some of the people have told me, and I do not keep that current on what happens now, the traditional rackets of the numbers, of money lending, a lot of that has been legalized. Like in Boston, the lottery, and this was openly admitted by the biggest Jewish bookmaker, Dr. Sagansky, when he was in something like 80 years old, he's being squeezed by a young mafioso for tribute money. He basically said that it's all gone. There's no more money left in it. The lottery took that whole audience. Instead of having to do things out of candy stores and bars on the QT, you can do it quite legally, and it's a public thing. So that killed most of the traditional numbers rackets. Money lending was destroyed by credit cards. Literally, I mean, easy credit, 20% interest. We could debate who was nicer. And then if you want to, those are the main areas where the Mafia operated. And then, you know, to the degree that they had infiltrated some unions, some types of unions, union membership is a fraction of what it was back then. So that influence and power, so many things have been outsourced or automated, you really, you know, the Mafia can't threaten to break the legs of an automatic machine. So a lot of these mainstays are gone. And the other thing is electronic surveillance. Nowadays they can see almost anything you do by satellite. The things that they had back in the 60s are very crude. Nowadays a cell phone is basically, for a gangster, it's basically a platform for self-incrimination with a tracking device. It basically has taken all of the profit out, and the penalties are so severe, they're not worth it. And then, you know, of course, things like extortion, which was never a huge mob mainstay, too easy to get caught. The only things that I hear that even of interest to some of these guys would be like a high-stakes private game. But even then, you're competing with casinos like Foxwoods and Mohegan Sun. So they put a lot of those things out of business. And when it comes to drugs, you're no longer dealing with organized crime, you're dealing with very disorganized crime that those traditional mobsters didn't like, not necessarily for moral reasons, but just because it was too fragmented, too dangerous, and you had to deal with too many moving parts that could go awry. And so I would say that most of those things, you know, and if you see some of the mobsters that are left and the things they get indicted for, they're laughable. You know, shaking down, you know, gentlemen's clubs and things like that for a few $100s. Stuff that frankly is petty, and that nowadays you can earn more money as an honest plaster than you can as a mafia soldier. It's not really worth it. So you're back to the degree that this stuff exists in any real way. It's fragmented, small. It's sort of receded back into where it came from. Yes, please.
What about the Bloods, the Crips, and the Latin Kings?
Different story there. A lot of that's very specific to their communities. When we say, I mean, in a broad sense, it's not organized crime that affects all society, but yes, that is a form of organized crime. But when we're talking about the legacy of the Mafia, where you had a much broader influence, where
So they're international.
They are international, but the things that they deal with tend to be very focused on things like drugs, sometimes protection. They tend to work within their own ethnic communities. So you are right, they are organized crime, but when we're talking about the Mafia, they're clearly not affiliated, they're parallel to it, and they tend to stay within their own boundaries, as the Mafia did till they moved out into politics and other things. But no, that is the other side of the question, that those things are still there, but they're quite different than the way the Mafia ran things. Please.
So police departments now, sort of the fraternity, and certainly not all police are corrupt, but they fashion a lot of stuff after the Mafia with extortion and protection and stuff like that?
That's kind of a broad statement.
And maybe not, maybe in, like, you know, in Serpico's time, whatever.
There's been a lot of doubt cast on the pervasiveness of the corruption that Serpico talked about. I mean, there's a very good book, I believe it's called Blue Blood, written by a career New York cop, a Harvard graduate, who acknowledged that there was a certain amount of corruption, yes, to the degree that Serpico said at the time, probably not. What I would say is this, and I can speak specifically about Boston, there was a huge amount of corruption in the 50s and 60s when it came to handling things like gambling. It was overlooked, and there were payoffs. Some cops didn't touch it. But you have to keep in mind that police were very badly paid at the time. You know, if you're earning the equivalent today of like $350 a week, risking your life, and you have partners who are on the take, and the guys you're supposed to arrest are your cousins or your friends, and there's no real supervision, then it makes law enforcement quite difficult. Nowadays, police are very well paid. It does attract different things. And we can debate law enforcement, but in terms of how, like in Boston and some of the other cities around Boston, yeah, there was a fairly large amount of corruption. Yes, there was. Please?
What became of Rico? Was he disgraced ever, or is he
He
retired in favor or out of
He
favor?
retired, and that's a huge topic, which I can't answer all the questions about it because they're still
Is he alive?
No, he died about 10 years ago, heart failure. But what happened with Rico, when there was a government oversight committee, a congressional committee that called a lot of these gangsters that were still alive to testify, and Rico was one of the people they called to testify to talk about the Deegan case. And Rico was very evasive, and Rico wound up being indicted, and he was arrested, and he died pending his trial. Rico, after he retired, and there's like a mandatory cutoff age for all FBI agents, I think it's 61, he had to retire, so he wound up taking a job with a highlight company, and the head of the company was assassinated by a Winter Hill assassin, and although nothing was ever proven, there's been this back and forth about what Rico's role as the chief security officer of that company was, and I don't have a position on it because it is a little confusing why Rico, what connection he would have to kill his own boss, that flagrantly, I don't know. But he was definitely tinged, and he has people who will say he was the most corrupt FBI agent ever, and there are ex-FBI agents who view him as having been a victim of mafia, long-term mafia and organized crime, besmirchment, and that they basically blackened his name one step at a time until finally he was arrested, and he died in disgrace.
He was arrested?
Oh yeah, yeah.
For?
He was accused of, I'm trying to remember which specific instance it was, but they got him in collusion for one of these things. I can't remember off the top of my head which one it was, but he was indicted and he died pending trial. He was very old and sickly.
Oh, so he wasn't working for the FBI?
Oh no, he had retired long before then. Long before then. This was after he gave testimony, and there was a very famous exchange between a congressman about one of the men who had gone to jail. Rico admitted the guy probably was innocent. This guy had gone to jail for life, had been in there for 20, 30 years. And the congressman asked him, you know, don't you feel any remorse about your role in this? And Rico said, what should I feel? You know, what about my role in this? What do you want, tears? And that became sort of the signature statement of Rico, his sneering, saying, what do you want, tears? And again, we could debate whether or not what happened was as gross a miscarriage of justice as some of the things that were done to civil rights leaders at the same time. I won't get into that, but the point is, he was when he wanted something, he was a very ruthless man, and without a doubt he did cut corners, and it came back to haunt his legacy. Other questions? Sure.
Did one of those guys have Kennedy killed?
I don't believe that. Which Kennedy though, also? I don't believe so. I'm not big into those particular conspiracies. No, I doubt that very much. And in both cases
And the
of
CIA.
the Kennedy assassinations, I doubt very much a professional mafia don with so much at stake who would be so painstaking would use a couple of misfit losers like Sirhan or Oswald to do their dirty work. I just don't buy that. So that's my own personal thinking on that one. Any other questions? Sure.
So what was your nickname?
Oh. It was just something my cousins used to call me when I was a kid, Marky. Only kidding. When I was a kid growing up in Boston, everybody had some kind of a nickname. Everybody. And so for obvious reasons, my girl cousins always called me Marky, and I grew up being called that without ever really thinking about it. And I hate that name. But everybody had some sort of little twist to the name or nickname or something like that. And certainly it applied in the criminal societies where you had to stand for B, and Joe Barboza had like 5, 6, 7, or 8 different aliases, including Seagull, Farouk, the animal. It just went on and on and on. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much, Mark.